Imagine a single city that conquered the known world. A city that built roads still walked today, wrote laws still studied in every courtroom on earth, and created an empire so vast that when it finally fell, the sound echoed through 1,000 years of darkness. This is the story of Rome, not the sanitized version from textbooks. The real story of ambition, genius, madness, and the slow, agonizing collapse of the greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced. Long before the marble temples and triumphal arches, there was nothing here but 7 muddy hills beside a river. The Tiber wound through marshland and scrub forest in central Italy, a landscape indistinguishable from 1,000 other places in the ancient Mediterranean. But something about this spot, the defensible hills, the river crossing, the salt flats nearby, drew people to settle here. By the 8th century before Christ, a cluster of hilltop villages dotted the Palatine and its neighboring rises, home to Latin-speaking shepherds and farmers who had no idea they were standing on the future capital of the world. The Romans told a different story about their origins, of course. They said twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, born of a mortal woman and the god Mars himself, were abandoned as infants and left to die beside the flooding Tiber. A she-wolf found them, nursed them, kept them alive against all odds. It was a founding myth that told you everything you needed to know about how Rome saw itself. Born from divine blood, raised by predators, and destined to survive. When the brothers grew to manhood, they quarreled over where to build their city. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill. Remus mocked him by leaping over the furrow his brother had plowed to mark the city's sacred boundary. For that act of contempt, according to legend, Romulus killed his own twin. Rome was born in blood. It would never stop drinking. The real founding of Rome was less dramatic, but no less remarkable. Around 753 BC, the traditional date matches archaeological evidence surprisingly well. The scattered villages on Rome's hills began to coalesce into something resembling a single community. They drained the marshy valley between the hills, creating a shared public space that would eventually become the Roman Forum. They weren't a great civilization yet. They were farmers, traders, and herders, who happened to live in a very good spot for controlling river traffic. For the first 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, 7 of them, according to tradition. The early kings were Latin and Sabine, but the last 3 were Etruscans, members of the sophisticated civilization that dominated central Italy. The Etruscans brought engineering, urban planning, and religious ritual to the rough hilltop settlement. They built Rome's first great temple, its first sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which still functions today, and introduced the Romans to Greek art and architecture. Rome learned fast, it always did. But the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, proved to be a tyrant. His family's crimes became legendary, and in 509 BC, the Roman aristocracy rose up and expelled him. They swore a sacred oath: Rome would never again be ruled by a king. That oath would hold for nearly 500 years. In place of monarchy, they created something unprecedented, a republic from res publica, the public thing. Power would belong not to one man, but to the people of Rome. The Roman Republic was an extraordinary political invention, imperfect and unequal, but revolutionary. 2 consuls shared supreme power, each able to veto the other, both limited to a single year in office. A senate of elder statesmen, all wealthy aristocrats, advised them and controlled the treasury. The system was designed with one overriding purpose: to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power. Every institution, every office, every law was a check on ambition. The Romans had learned what unchecked authority could do, and they were determined never to learn that lesson again. But the Republic was not a democracy, not in any modern sense. It was an oligarchy with democratic features. The patricians, old noble families who traced their lineage to Rome's founding, held a stranglehold on political power. The plebeians, the common citizens, had the right to vote, but almost no ability to hold office or shape policy. This tension between the aristocratic few and the common many would define Roman politics for centuries, and it would ultimately tear the Republic apart. The plebeians fought back with the most powerful tool available to them. They went on strike. In a series of conflicts called the Struggle of the Orders, common citizens literally withdrew from the city, refusing to work or serve in the army until their demands were met. Over nearly 2 centuries, they won the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, and ultimately forced the codification of Roman law in the 12 Tables around 450 BC. For the first time, the law was written down where anyone could read it. It was a radical act. In the ancient world, unwritten law was whatever the powerful said it was. While Rome sorted out its internal politics, it was also fighting, constantly. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Rome fought its neighbors, the Latins, the Samnites, the Etruscans, and wave after wave of Celtic raiders from the north. In 390 BC, a Gallic army actually sacked Rome itself, burning most of the city. The humiliation seared itself into the Roman psyche. Never again, they vowed. They rebuilt, they rearmed, and they began a systematic conquest of the Italian peninsula that would take another century to complete. By 264 BC, Rome controlled all of mainland Italy, and now it looked south, across the narrow strait to Sicily, where it collided with the other great power of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. The Carthaginians were Phoenician traders who had built a commercial empire spanning North Africa, Spain, and the Western Islands. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and had the most powerful navy in the ancient world. Rome had no navy at all. What the Romans did next defined their civilization. They captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship, reverse-engineered it, and built an entire fleet from scratch in 60 days. When their sailors proved inferior to the experienced Carthaginian crews, the Romans invented a new device, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into the hand-to-hand land combat they excelled at. They adapted, they innovated. They refused to accept that any problem was unsolvable. The First Punic War lasted 23 brutal years, and Rome won. But Carthage was not finished. In 218 BC, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca embarked on one of the most audacious military campaigns in human history. He marched an army of 50,000 men, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants from Spain, across the south of France and over the Alps in winter. The crossing took 15 days. He lost nearly half his men and most of his elephants to avalanches, exposure, and hostile mountain tribes. But those who survived emerged on the plains of northern Italy, behind Rome's defenses, and they were very, very angry. What followed was a masterclass in tactical genius. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal shattered Roman army after Roman army. Cannae was the worst single-day military disaster in Roman history. Between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers fell in a single afternoon, victims of Hannibal's famous double envelopment, a maneuver still studied in military academies today. The road to Rome lay open. Hannibal never took it. This is one of history's great what-ifs. Instead of marching on a defenseless Rome, he spent years campaigning through southern Italy, trying and failing to convince Rome's Italian allies to defect. And Rome, with a stubbornness that bordered on insanity, simply refused to surrender. They raised new armies. They adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battle and wearing Hannibal down. When a young general named Scipio proposed taking the war to Africa, attacking Carthage itself, the Senate, desperate and bold, agreed. Scipio landed in Africa in 204 BC, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his homeland. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, the two greatest generals of their age met face to face. Scipio won. Carthage surrendered, paid a massive indemnity, and gave up its fleet. But Rome's hatred ran deep. 50 years later, the elder statesman Cato would end every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the same words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 146 BC, Rome made good on that promise. After a 3-year siege, Roman soldiers burned Carthage to the ground. The city was demolished systematically, its population killed or enslaved, and the site was cursed and left desolate. Later legends claimed the earth was salted, though no ancient source records this. An entire civilization was erased. The message was clear. Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it obliterated them. In the same year it destroyed Carthage, Rome also conquered Corinth, absorbing Greece into its growing empire. Over the next century, the Eastern Mediterranean fell piece by piece: Macedonia, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt. Rome now ruled an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Persia. But the Republic's institutions, designed to govern a single city-state, were buckling under the weight of running the known world. Conquest brought unimaginable wealth flooding into Rome, and that wealth poisoned the Republic. A new class of super-rich emerged: senators and generals who had plundered the East and used their fortunes to buy political influence, vast estates, and armies of slaves. Meanwhile, the small farmers who had been the backbone of both the Roman economy and its military found themselves unable to compete with slave-worked plantations. They lost their land, streamed into Rome, and joined a growing urban underclass with nothing to lose and everything to demand. Two brothers tried to fix this. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, aristocrats who championed the common people, proposed radical land reforms to redistribute public land to the poor. The Senate, which had the most to lose, responded not with debate, but with violence. Tiberius was beaten to death in 133 BC by a mob of senators wielding chair legs. His brother Gaius died 12 years later in similar political violence. The message was unmistakable. The Roman Republic would rather kill its own reformers than share its wealth. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The army itself became the instrument of the Republic's destruction. In 107 BC, the general Gaius Marius reformed the Roman military, opening service to the landless poor and providing soldiers with equipment at state expense. It was a practical solution to a recruitment crisis, but it had a catastrophic side effect. Soldiers now owed their livelihoods not to the Republic, but to their individual commander, the man who paid them, promoted them, and promised them land when they retired. The legions became personal armies, loyal to ambitious generals rather than to Rome. The first man to fully exploit this was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BC, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself. No Roman general had ever turned his legions against the city. Sulla captured Rome, butchered his political opponents, and declared himself dictator. He reformed the constitution to strengthen the Senate's power, then retired voluntarily to his country estate, where he died shortly after. He had shown every ambitious man in Rome exactly how the game was played. The genie was out of the bottle. In the chaos that followed Sulla's death, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus led the most famous slave revolt in ancient history. Beginning with just 74 escaped gladiators in 73 BC, Spartacus built an army of over 100,000 enslaved people who fought for their freedom across the Italian peninsula for 2 years. When the revolt was finally crushed, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road from Capua to Rome for over 100 miles. It was Roman power at its most brutal and its most terrified. As the Republic staggered through its final decades, 3 men emerged who would determine its fate. Pompey, the greatest general of his generation; Crassus, the richest man in Rome; and Gaius Julius Caesar, a brilliant, charismatic, and dangerously ambitious politician from an old but impoverished noble family. In 60 BC, these 3 formed an informal alliance, the first triumvirate, and effectively controlled the Roman state among them. It was a partnership born of convenience, and it would not last. Caesar got Gaul. For 9 years, from 58 to 49 BC, he waged a relentless campaign of conquest across modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain. He fought over 30 major engagements, conquered 800 cities, and by his own probably exaggerated account, killed over 1 million people. He also wrote the account of his wars himself, De Bello Gallico, making sure that all of Rome heard of his exploits. Caesar returned from Gaul as the most famous, most popular, and most dangerous man in the Roman world. The Senate, led by Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. On January 10, 49 BC, Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, a small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary between his province and Rome itself. Roman law was absolute on this point. No general could bring his army across that line. To cross was treason. To cross was civil war. Ancient sources say he paused, then uttered the words that have echoed through history. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. Caesar crossed, his legions followed, and the Roman Republic, already mortally wounded, began its final death spiral. The civil war was swift and decisive. Pompey fled to Greece, then Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach by agents of the Egyptian pharaoh, hoping to curry favor with the victor. Caesar arrived in Egypt to find his rival dead, and his young co-ruler, Cleopatra, smuggled into his presence, rolled in a carpet. The affair that followed would reshape the Mediterranean world. By 46 BC, Caesar was master of the Roman world. He was named dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. He reformed the calendar, extended citizenship to conquered peoples, launched massive building projects, and proposed legislation to help the poor. He was brilliant, magnanimous to his defeated enemies, and utterly intolerable to the Senate. A man who held absolute power for life was a king in all but name, and Rome had sworn 5 centuries ago that it would never have a king again. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a group of senators surrounded Caesar in the theatre of Pompey and struck him down. There were 23 wounds on his body. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, called themselves liberators. They believed they were saving the Republic. They were wrong. The Republic was already dead. They had only murdered the man who might have replaced it with something functional. Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another round of civil wars. His adopted heir, the 18-year-old Octavian, formed an alliance with Mark Antony and the general Lepidus, the second triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins, prescribed and executed thousands of their political enemies, and then turned on each other. Antony took the east and allied himself with Cleopatra of Egypt. Octavian took the west and systematically built his power base in Rome, portraying Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Roman values for Eastern decadence. The final showdown came at Actium in 31 BC, off the coast of western Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt, where both would die within the year. Antony by his own hand, Cleopatra by the famous asp, though the true method of her death remains debated. Egypt became a Roman province. The Mediterranean was united under one man's rule for the first time in history. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, the revered one, was the most brilliant political mind in Roman history. He understood what Caesar had not, that Romans would accept absolute power only if it was disguised. He kept every institution of the Republic, the Senate, the consuls, the popular assemblies, but drained them of real authority while claiming to be merely the first citizen, the princeps. He was emperor in all but name, and the Republic became the empire. This was perhaps the most successful political con in human history, and it worked because Augustus made it work. For 45 years. Augustus found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, his own words, and largely true. He launched the most ambitious building program the world had ever seen. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars Ultor, the Ara Pacis, monuments designed to proclaim that a new age of peace and prosperity had dawned. And it had. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, would last over 2 centuries. Trade flourished, cities grew, and for millions of people across 3 continents, life became measurably better under Rome's protective umbrella. Augustus died in 14 AD, reportedly whispering to his friends, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." He had played it masterfully. But the system he created had one fatal flaw. It had no reliable mechanism for succession. Augustus passed power to his stepson Tiberius, beginning a dynasty that would demonstrate just how badly one-man rule could go wrong. Tiberius became a paranoid recluse. Caligula, who followed, may have been genuinely insane. He reportedly declared himself a god, held conversations with the moon, and planned to make his horse a consul. Claudius, dismissed as a fool because of his stammer and limp, surprised everyone by being a competent administrator who conquered Britain. And then came Nero. Nero is one of history's most infamous figures, and separating fact from later propaganda is nearly impossible. What we know is that in 64 AD, a catastrophic fire swept through Rome, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts over 9 days. Ancient sources claim Nero sang while the city burned. Whether or not that is true, he used the devastation to build himself an enormous pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, on the cleared land, and he blamed the fire on a small, obscure religious sect called the Christians, launching the first Roman persecution against them. Nero's excesses eventually turned the military against him. When the legions revolted, the Senate declared him a public enemy. He died in 68 AD, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, reportedly crying, "What an artist dies in me." His death unleashed chaos, the year of the 4 emperors, a civil war that saw Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each briefly seize power before being killed in turn. Order was restored by Vespasian, a gruff, practical soldier who founded the Flavian dynasty. His greatest legacy stands to this day. On the site of Nero's despised Golden House, Vespasian built the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum. It was a political masterstroke. Where a tyrant had built his private pleasure palace, the new emperor built the people's arena. It held 50,000 spectators and remains the most iconic structure in Rome. Vespasian's son Titus took power in 79 AD and within months faced one of the ancient world's greatest natural disasters. On August 24th, Mount Vesuvius exploded, releasing thermal energy an estimated 100,000 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried under roughly 20 feet of volcanic ash and superheated gas in a matter of hours. Thousands of people perished. Ancient sources do not give a precise death toll, but modern estimates for the region range widely into the thousands. But from that horror came an extraordinary gift to history. Vesuvius preserved Pompeii like a time capsule, freezing an ordinary Roman city in the middle of an ordinary August day. We have their bakeries with bread still in the ovens, their taverns with rude graffiti on the walls, their election posters, their love letters, their laundry lists. No other source gives us such an intimate, unfiltered look at how real Romans actually lived. After the brief and brutal reign of Titus's brother Domitian, the Roman Empire entered its greatest age. The historian Edward Gibbon called the era of the 5 good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the period in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. For nearly a century, from 96 to 180 AD, power transferred peacefully through adoption rather than blood inheritance, and each emperor proved worthy of the responsibility. Trajan pushed the empire to its maximum territorial extent. Born in Spain, the first emperor from outside Italy, he conquered Dacia, modern Romania, and briefly added Mesopotamia to the empire. At its height under Trajan, Rome ruled approximately 5 million square kilometers and between 60 and 70 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's entire population. A single political entity had never controlled so much of the human race. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, was the opposite kind of emperor, a builder, a traveler, and a consolidator. He abandoned Trajan's overextended conquests in Mesopotamia and spent much of his 21-year reign traveling the empire's provinces. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a wall spanning the entire width of the island, 80 miles from coast to coast. Hadrian's Wall was more than a military fortification. It was a statement, this far and no further. The empire had reached its natural limits. The last of the 5 good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. He spent much of his reign on the empire's northern frontier, fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube, and wrote his private journal, the Meditations, by lamplight in his campaign tent. It remains one of the most widely read works of philosophy in the Western canon. "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be," he wrote. Be one. He was the last great pagan emperor, and perhaps the best man ever to hold absolute power. Marcus Aurelius broke the chain of adopted succession. Instead of choosing the best man available, he passed power to his biological son, Commodus. It was a catastrophic mistake. Commodus was vain, unstable, and obsessed with performing as a gladiator in the arena, an act considered beneath the dignity of any citizen, let alone an emperor. After 12 years of misrule, he was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner on New Year's Eve, 192 AD. The Golden Age was over. Before we watch the empire's long decline, it is worth pausing to consider what Rome actually achieved at its height. The empire built over 50,000 miles of paved roads, enough to wrap twice around the earth. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water across hundreds of miles, some still functioning 2,000 years later. Roman concrete, using volcanic ash, was stronger than anything produced until the 19th century. And Roman law, the concept that citizens have rights, that the accused deserve a defense, that the law applies equally to all, became the foundation of every Western legal system. But Rome's greatest achievement may have been the most mundane. For ordinary people across the empire, farmers in Gaul, merchants in Syria, craftsmen in North Africa, the Pax Romana meant something astonishing. The realistic expectation that you could live your entire life without experiencing war. You could travel from Britain to Egypt on Roman roads, using Roman coins, protected by Roman law, speaking either Latin or Greek, and being understood everywhere. In the ancient world, that was a miracle. The 3rd century was a nightmare. After Commodus, the empire entered a period of constant civil war, plague, and economic collapse that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 25 emperors, most of whom died violently. The army made and unmade rulers at will. The empire's borders were breached by Germanic tribes in the west and a resurgent Persian empire in the east. For a time, the empire actually fractured into 3 separate states. In the east, the desert city of Palmyra, under its warrior queen Zenobia, carved out an independent empire that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia. Zenobia was one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world. A woman who rode at the head of her armies, claimed descent from Cleopatra, and defied Rome for years. When the Emperor Aurelian finally defeated and captured her in 272 AD, he paraded her through Rome in golden chains. But even he acknowledged her courage. The man who put the empire back together for good was Diocletian, a soldier's son from the Balkans who rose through the ranks to become emperor in 284 AD. Diocletian recognized that the empire had simply become too large for one man to govern. His solution was radical. He split it in 2. The Tetrarchy, rule of 4, placed 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars in charge of different regions. It was an acknowledgement that the system Augustus had built 3 centuries earlier was no longer functional. Diocletian also launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians, a community that had grown steadily for 2.5 centuries despite periodic repression. Churches were demolished, scriptures burned, and Christians were stripped of their legal rights. It was a brutal campaign, and it was a complete failure. You cannot destroy a faith by making martyrs. In 312 AD, one of Diocletian's successors, Constantine, was marching toward Rome to fight a rival claimant to the throne. On the eve of battle, according to the historian Eusebius, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the story is literally true, symbolically embroidered, or politically convenient, what happened next is indisputable. Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, became sole emperor of the West, and threw his support behind Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity went from persecuted cult to favored faith almost overnight. Churches began rising where temples had stood. Bishops became political powers. The theological debates of Christian councils, like the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which Constantine himself presided over, became matters of imperial policy. Rome, the city that had fed Christians to wild animals, was becoming the seat of the Christian world. Constantine made another decision that would reshape history. He built a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the strategic crossroads where Europe meets Asia. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was inaugurated in 330 AD. It was designed to be a new Rome, a Christian Rome, facing east rather than west. Constantine may not have intended it as a replacement for Rome, but that is exactly what it became. In 380 AD, the Emperor Theodosius took the final step. He declared Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were closed. The Olympic Games, held for over 1,000 years, were abolished. The eternal flame of the Vestal Virgins, which had burned continuously for over 1,000 years, was extinguished. An empire founded on the worship of Jupiter and Mars now knelt before a crucified carpenter from Galilee. The transformation was total. In 395 AD, Theodosius died, and the empire was divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This time, the split was permanent. The eastern and western halves would never be reunited. And while the east would thrive for another 1,000 years, the west was about to experience a century of catastrophe. On the last night of the year 406 AD, the Rhine River froze solid. Tens of thousands of Germanic peoples, Vandals, Alans, Suebi, Burgundians, walked across the ice into Roman Gaul. The frontier, which Rome had defended for 4 centuries, simply ceased to exist. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense. These were entire peoples, men, women, children, fleeing westward before an even greater terror from the east: the Huns. In August of 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric did what no foreign enemy had done in 800 years. He entered Rome. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered the city. The physical damage was relatively limited. Alaric was a Christian and ordered churches spared. But the psychological impact was incalculable. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, wept. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Saint Augustine began writing The City of God, arguing that Rome's fall proved that earthly empires are fleeting, and only God's kingdom endures. The Western Empire did not fall all at once. It crumbled in slow motion over the next 66 years. Britain was abandoned around 410 AD. Africa fell to the Vandals in the 430s. Gaul was carved up between Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths. Spain went to the Suebi and then the Visigoths. Each loss stripped the Western Empire of tax revenue and military manpower, accelerating the next loss in a vicious spiral of decline. In the middle of this collapse came the most feared figure of the ancient world. Attila the Hun united the Hunnic tribes into a formidable empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of Gaul. The Romans called him the Scourge of God. In 451 AD, Attila invaded Gaul with an army of 500,000 men, almost certainly an exaggeration, but his force was enormous. He was stopped at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains by a combined Roman and Visigothic army, one of the last great military achievements of the Western Empire. The following year, Attila turned toward Italy itself. What stopped him is one of history's enduring mysteries. Pope Leo XI rode out to meet the Hun king, and after their conversation, Attila withdrew. Whether Leo bribed him, threatened him with divine retribution, or whether Attila's army was simply ravaged by plague and supply shortages, we will never know. Attila died the following year, choking on a nosebleed on his wedding night, and the Hunnic Empire disintegrated almost overnight. But the damage was done. In 455 AD, the Vandals sailed from North Africa and sacked Rome far more thoroughly than Alaric had. For 14 days, they systematically stripped the city of its treasures, including, according to tradition, the sacred objects from the Temple of Jerusalem that Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier. The word vandalism entered the language. The last decades of the Western Empire were a parade of puppet emperors controlled by Germanic generals. Real power belonged to men like Ricimer, a half-Visigoth, half-Suevian strongman who made and unmade emperors at will. The irony was complete. The empire that had conquered the barbarian world was now governed by barbarians in all but name. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was a boy. His name, with the cruelest irony history has ever produced, was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, like the founder. Augustus, like the first emperor. He was perhaps 14 years old when his father, the general Orestes, placed him on the throne in October 475 AD. He was a figurehead, a puppet, a child wearing the costume of an empire that no longer existed. On September 4th, 476 AD, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. There was no battle, no last stand, no dramatic final scene. Odoacer simply told the boy to go home, granted him a pension and a villa in Campania, and sent the imperial regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the symbols of 1,000 years of Roman authority, to Constantinople. There was no longer a need for an emperor in the West, he said. One emperor in Constantinople was sufficient. But Rome did not truly die, not entirely. In the East, the empire that historians would later call Byzantine continued for nearly 1,000 more years. Constantinople became the greatest city in the medieval world, wealthy, cultured, and fiercely Christian. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, even attempted to reconquer the West, briefly recapturing Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. He also codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which remains the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe and much of the world. The legacy of Rome did not end with the fall of the West. It transformed. The Roman Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome itself, preserved Latin, maintained Roman administrative structures, and carried Roman culture through the medieval period. The very title Pope comes from the Latin papa. The organization of the Church into dioceses mirrors Roman provincial administration. When Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day 800 AD, it was an explicit attempt to resurrect what had been lost. Roman law lives in every courtroom in the Western world. Roman engineering principles underlie every bridge, aqueduct, and highway. The Latin language evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, and contributed thousands of words to English and every other European language. The Roman alphabet, the very letters you are reading now, carries Rome's influence into every text message, every novel, every scientific paper written in the Western tradition. The roads are perhaps the most fitting metaphor. 2,000 years after they were built, Roman roads still determine the routes of modern highways across Europe. The streets of London follow Roman paths. The cities of Cologne, Vienna, Paris, and Barcelona all began as Roman military camps. When you walk through these cities, you are walking in Roman footsteps, whether you know it or not. Historians have debated the causes of Rome's fall for over 1,500 years. Edward Gibbon blamed Christianity for sapping Roman martial virtue. Others point to lead poisoning, moral decay, economic collapse, military overextension, plague, climate change. or the simple mathematical impossibility of defending a frontier thousands of miles long against increasingly organized enemies. The truth is that no single cause killed Rome. Like most great civilizations, it died of 100 wounds, some self-inflicted, some dealt by fate and circumstance. Perhaps the most important lesson of Rome is not why it fell, but how long it endured. From the founding of the Republic in 509 BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD, an event we have not even reached in this story, Roman civilization persisted in some form for nearly 2,000 years. No other political entity in Western history comes close. The Roman Empire was not a moment, it was an epoch. And some things the Romans built will outlast us all. The Pantheon in Rome, built by Hadrian in 125 AD, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Its oculus, the circular opening at the apex, still lets in rain and sunlight exactly as it did 1900 years ago. When you stand beneath it and look up, you see the same sky the Romans saw. The same rain falls on the same floor. In that moment, 2,000 years collapse into nothing, and you understand, truly understand, that Rome never fell. Not really. It simply became the world we live in. From 7 muddy hills beside a river to an empire that encompassed the known world. From a she-wolf and 2 abandoned infants to the most enduring civilization in Western history. Rome rose, Rome conquered, Rome transformed, and Rome fell, but its echo never faded. Every road we drive, every law we follow, every word on this page carries a piece of Rome within it. The eternal city earned its name, and its story, our story, is far from over.